Developers are kind of tarnished as this horrible money-grabbing people that come in and destroy areas, roll out in our Rolls Royces drinking champagne. We care about what we do and we want to leave a positive legacy. Planning is a very emotive topic. I think as a nation we are quite anti-change. We had one site which took us 9.5 years. That one was very, very torturous. Been threatened by public people. You have to understand the risks of what you're taking on, the gravity of the situation if that doesn't go right. I think property development has become a bit of a buzzword, retire early, all these kind of get-rich-quick schemes. There's examples in Croydon, studio flats, 13, 14 square metres. We're going backwards, not forwards. We have a responsibility in this industry to create homes that are fit for purpose. You could name me a property in Croydon, I'd reel off the planning history of that property off by heart. I would study the planning list almost daily. We don't give up on sites. Going back to your first question, I think another piece of great advice is
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Property People. I am today delighted to be joined by Mr. Justin Owens. How are you today, Justin?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good. So, Justin, you are the founder and managing partner of the Silverleaf Group, a property development and investment company based out of Croydon, established in 2003, so over 20 years, with three main operations: acquisition of land and properties with development potential, either by way of conditional or unconditional purchase, acquisition of distressed real estate assets, and the development of residential, commercial, and mixed-use schemes across London, Surrey, West Sussex, and Kent. And along the way, you've become a property award-winning developer, which is impressive to say the least. So a lot to unpack, but before we go into all of that, I always like to start at the beginning.
Yeah.
What type of person were you at school, and did you always think that you were going to be this big property developer when you grew up?
Not at all. So my family were involved in property, my dad particularly, but I wasn't really interested in it. I was quite entrepreneurial at school, I would say. I think my friends always would say that about me. So when I was, 12, 13 years old, I set up my own mobile joke shop that people could buy stuff from. So I had a briefcase that I converted into a shop. I'd take it into school every day and sell people stuff from like whoopee cushions to various other stuff that I'd bought from a local shop, and then I did my markup and I sold. And then that rolled into having a sweet shop because I saw a bigger opportunity there with the tuck shop at school. So I used to take in every day a massive school bag and at lunchtime and break time sell sweets and drinks to all my schoolmates. And I used to make probably about £8 a day, which at 14, 15 wasn't bad going.
Very good. Tax-free.
I don't think I had to do a tax return at that age, but
Very good. It's interesting that you've got that entrepreneurial spirit. Some people say that, it has been said that if you have entrepreneurial parents, there's a higher likelihood that you will also follow in those footsteps. I think the same thing goes with things like alcoholism and all sorts of stuff. So it's good to have, sometimes it's good to have that surrounding and that environment. Were you inspired by people around you, and how did you eventually go from that entrepreneurial spirit to getting into the property business?
Sure. I think, you're a product of your environment, aren't you? And
100%.
My dad was a developer. My mum and dad were developers. They used to sort of develop property out. Then they separated when I was about 11 years old.
Right.
And I ended up living with my dad. But he always encouraged me to kind of pursue any ideas that I had, good or bad. And so I think that was always the sort of beginning of those foundations. I did quite well at school, but I didn't enjoy school particularly. I got sort of itchy feet. So when I got to 16 years old, I was like, I just want to get out and work. I don't want to keep going down this path. It's not for me. So I went and got a job where I did my work experience, which was fitting car stereos and alarms at a shop in South Croydon. Excuse me. And I ended up working there for about a year, got made redundant because actually their business was kind of on the downward tick. And then I went for another company similar. And then in that time, I decided that I want to pursue an idea that I had, which was to do with music. So I set up a business when I was about 17, 18, and that was my first business. And I did that for about 8 years.
As in the music business?
Yeah.
And what was that exactly?
So everything from managing artists to running parties, and it was great. It was a great life experience. It wasn't particularly successful monetary wise, but I was young. I had the ability to travel the world with some of the artists that I was looking after. So at that age, it was something that none of my friends were doing. I was managing to do this stuff, and I got to meet a lot of people along the way. And for me, I actually use a lot of the skills that I learned from that now because I met people from all walks of life.
Yeah.
And so it gives you very good social skills, which you need when you're doing development, basically.
Completely makes sense. Yeah, I mean, you're dealing a lot with artists as well, and they can be quite quirky. I mean, was this like heavy metal, rock and roll? Was it?
No, all electronic
Electronic.
music.
Oh,
So
very
yeah,
cool.
house music mainly. Yeah.
Very nice, very cool. And then you quickly found out. Well, not quickly. It took you 8 years to realize that this is probably not going to make me happy or wealthy or both.
It made me happy, but
Yeah.
it probably didn't make me wealthy. And my dad was always on my case to just sort of try a property, get into property, and follow in his footsteps in that sense. So we sort of came to an agreement where he said, "Look, just do one deal, see how you get on, see if you like it or not, and if you do, then you can obviously continue. If not, I'll kind of leave you to do whatever it is that you decide to do with your life." So I was like, okay. It's an easy way out. Let me give this a go. And before that, I'd been helping him quite a lot with his own stuff because he's not overly computer literate.
Yeah.
So I was helping him. He used to do all of his own appeals, all of his own planning applications. It was a very different time then to now in terms of the information and how you have to present it.
Right, of course.
But he used to package up his own applications. And I would help him with that. So I had some understanding from quite a young age as to kind of what was involved in that process.
So with the progression from running your own business in kind of music and managing artists and throwing parties and then doing your first development, tell us about what that development was. Was it a house refurb? Was it did it have a planning element to it?
Yeah, so my dad has always focused on planning gain, essentially. So finding sites that have development potential and then getting planning permission and obviously realising an extra value by way of that planning process. So we found a semi-detached house, came on the market on Rightmove or, well, whatever it may not have been Rightmove at that point, but came on the market. We went to see it. It was a semi-detached house and it had a garage to the side and it was quite a large side plot and we felt that we could probably get another house in that area. So we bought the house unconditional and this was at a time where we really didn't have a lot of money. This was kind of all or nothing. We managed to just about scrape together deposit money, got a mortgage on it, and applied for planning permission, and the council duly refused it. So we basically had to go to appeal, and in that time we'd rented the house out, so at least it was kind of generating some income. And at appeal, we were fortunate enough to be granted permission for the extra house to the side.
Interesting. So, when you buy something like that unconditionally, are you buying it cash or are you buying it with some finance on it? Because
no, that had a 90% mortgage with Bank of Scotland at the time.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So yeah, we were. Everything was in that house. Basically, this had to happen.
Has to work out.
Yeah.
And so, where does sometimes I hear of people that do planning strategies and deploy a lot of resources behind that stuff, but they're pretty confident that they even know that it's going to go to appeal. They're like, I know this, but I'm pretty confident, 99% or 95% sure that it should go through. Were you in that one that sure, or at least was your father that sure?
Yeah, I think he obviously felt comfortable enough with it to warrant us doing the deal.
Yeah.
From my perspective, it was my first deal, so I was heavily reliant on what he's kind of advising me and telling me, and I didn't really know the difficulties of the planning system at that time and how political it can often be. So whilst we had some officer support at the beginning because neighbours started objecting and so on, we then got faced with a refusal, and then we had to go to appeal. And the appeal system is helpful, but it's by no means guaranteed.
Sure. And I mean, the appeal system, just to touch on that point very quickly, back then and now, has it got worse or is
Yes.
it improved? It's got worse.
Yeah, because in our experience, back in that day, most inspectors were fairly long-term inspectors. They've been doing the job a long time. They typically came from a planning background, and so they had vast amounts of experience. And so the judgments that you would get typically would be fair and reasonable. Not always. You're always biased on your own applications, of course. But in general terms, you had faith that decision was going to be a good one if you presented the right application. I think now, where we went through COVID and we went through sort of previous recessions, a lot of inspectors retired during that time. So they've had to employ a lot more new inspectors. And to be a planning inspector, you don't necessarily need to have a full planning background. You can come from other professions and step into being a planning inspector. And therefore, it's quite subjective. Particularly when you're talking about things like character and various nuances that aren't black and white points of choice, you're then innately going to get people's own opinions starting to come through a little bit. There's that unconscious bias basically on their own views as to what is good or bad design, for example.
There was somebody that because planning is becoming more and more of an issue. I think if we look back to 2008, obviously access to capital itself was a big issue. And nowadays, with so many different lenders in the market, you've got brokers like myself who are navigating all of that. And there's liquidity. It's kind of fair to say. It's just how you get access to it, or having access to the best of it is probably the challenge, but something that can be overcome because of the availability in itself. Planning, though, seems to be right now the biggest constraint in terms of solving the affordable housing crisis. And there just seems to be no rock solid solution in sight, which, like, different people have been saying different things. I've been following kind of Facebook groups and threads and forums and all sorts, and having different conversation with different people. One particular person was saying that you should be allowed to kind of the massing of a building should be automatically agreed in a specific time, space and location. And then the externals, that can be agreed later on, but it's going to get agreed with somebody along the way so I mean, what's your take on it? You're in this day in, day out. What is the biggest reason that we have such difficulty with the planning system, and it's getting worse, not better? And any suggestions or solutions that you can throw out?
Sure. I think there's a number of factors as to why over time it's got gradually worse. Underfunding of the planning system is a huge problem, as with a lot of public departments at the moment. But I think planning has been ignored. And typically any increase in planning fees and costs and pre-app fees and things like that are not typically ring-fenced within a council. So whilst on paper they seem to be driving more income into their department, quite often that can then get taken and put elsewhere within a council. So they're very constrained. And also, if you look at kind of salary levels of planning officers as compared to the private sector of the industry, there's quite a gap there. And so, quite often the very agile and top of their game planning officers might often get poached and move into the private sector. I actually have quite a lot of admiration for most planning officers because their job is not easy. They're dealing with private client side applicants who obviously want to get planning permission and they want to get it as quickly as possible. And I'm sure some can be sort of quite aggressive in the way in which they approach that. But then they're also dealing with obviously all of the public interest, and planning is a very emotive topic for the private individual. I think as a nation we are quite anti-change, and where planning and development has become very politicised, certainly of the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and we'll probably see that increase as we head towards the general election this year, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's created divide, and so developers are kind of tarnished as this one-size-fits-all, horrible money-grabbing people that come in and destroy areas and roll out in our Rolls Royces drinking champagne, and leave communities kind of destroyed with our development. But I think that that's an unfair characterization of a lot of developers. I'm sure there are, as with any industry, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
But certainly the people I know, and I'd like to think myself is included in that, we care about what we do and we want to leave a positive legacy. And we're aware that our point of view is not always going to be agreeable with other people. But I think there's been a movement in the press, in politics, that's become very divisive between kind of us and them. And that needs to be fixed in some way where it is a bit more collaborative in its approach. And perhaps a way of dealing with that is, as you suggested, maybe zoning. So it takes the unknown out of it. Because I think a lot of it comes from, I could put an application in on any property, and that's going to come as a shock, perhaps, to the people around it. If you're buying a house and you know that next door to you at any point can be a 3-story building that's houses or flats, if that application comes in, you might be a bit disappointed, but you're going to know it's coming at some point, so that shock has gone. I don't know. There's a lots of facets to the planning system, but there is also a lot broken with it at the moment.
Yeah, I think exactly that. It's kind of zoning, pretty much, with the what I'd proposed that I'd read on I think it was a Facebook thread. But ultimately, the same reasons why what you've given as well is that generally these officers that work at the planning department, they are overworked, underpaid. Any of the good ones will probably move over to the private side. I did a post recently about turnaround times and the uncertainty in the planning system on LinkedIn, which, from time to time I get some good feedback and good conversation going. And I was asking if any of these departments could say anything about come out, but there's nobody who has a voice there as well. There's no accountability. There's no voice there. With 13 different housing ministers, I think in 13 years is the record at the moment. It's kind of no wonder that nobody's been able to put in any sort of long-term plan to be able to really resolve this issue, and therefore it just gets worse and worse. And the interesting thing is, from my point of view, is there are these prop tech tools like Land Insight and Nimbus and Searchland and this, that, and the other, and which should make finding sites and designing things a lot easier for developers. So we should be able to, like back in the day, probably when your dad was doing it, they would have to send off to find an OS map and get it delivered over, and it's just like really old-fashioned.
We used to drive around. I remember as a kid driving around with him, and he'd literally just go driving around areas and looking over fences and knocking on people's doors, because that's how you found sites back in that day.
Exactly. So you'd think we'd be able to bring more sites to market with these new tools that we've got, but it's not necessarily the case.
I think there perhaps is more sites, but in the same way, that's also contributing to the issue slightly, in the sense that where I think property development has become a bit of a buzzword in terms of social media, how to retire early, all these kind of get-rich-quick schemes that appear and come and go. If you're just showing someone the basics of, here's Land Insight, for example, this is what you can put in and it will churn you out some potential sites, and then you're smashing 1,000 letters out a week, they then might take some of those sites forward, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to put in an application that is right. But they're sort of burdening the system in some ways, because obviously planning departments are just getting flooded with applications. They're getting refused because they're probably not appropriate necessarily, or there are issues with how they're being presented. They're then going to appeal, so the whole system is creaking and grinding to a halt.
It's a very interesting take on it, yeah.
So, technology is great in some ways, but it can also have its own issues that it brings to the table as well.
I think it's a very, very good point, and it probably is true that there are a lot of people not looking at policy properly and thinking, oh, I can get 3 flats there and I can get 5 flats there, and it's like, well, there needs a car park 1-to-1 ratio. I literally, I can speak from saying I've literally had that myself, where it didn't go through. So, and if you times that by 10 or 100, which is likely, then you're just working people to no end and not getting the results that we need. And then you've got things like permitted development, whereby it should fast track a lot of the permissions. But then we hear a lot of negativity around, well, these are not really these are substandard housing. It's like these are not really good quality housing. So what's your take on the whole permitted development thing? Because I think of the latest budget, they announced that they were going to bring out a new PD for a house into 2 flats. So do you think that this is a good step in the right direction, or do you think actually it shouldn't be the answer?
I don't think it's the answer. You're contributing probably quite a small amount of new homes, given the deficit that we sit at the moment, by introducing these sort of PD rules. I think they're quite good for PR, from a PR perspective, but the quality and standard of some of that accommodation is not always what I believe it should be. And so, I think when they first brought out, as an example, when they first brought out office to resi conversions, it was a very rushed approach from government. And rather than applying the housing design standards, which they had, it was a document there which they could very easily have conditioned that any new homes would have to apply to that standard. Sorry, I've got a flyer. Apply to that standard. They didn't. And so we ended up with, there's examples in Croydon of studio flats that are sort of 13, 14 square meters. And we're going backwards, not forwards, when we start introducing housing stock like that. And really, I think we have a responsibility in this industry, and as a government, certainly, to create homes that are fit for purpose. And studios of that size, in my opinion, are just simply not fit for purpose.
What about for students?
I think they're slightly different if you've got large breakout areas and communal facilities, and it's part of the overall package. That's a different topology, sure, and type of accommodation that suits a different need. But if you're talking about just a general person that probably is struggling to find rent to pay for a sort of normal property, I still think even 13 square meters, you should have more space than that to be able to live.
13 square meters is definitely tight. I mean, I've got some self-contained studios that it's kind of in a student block, and they're averaging about 20. So once you start getting down to 13, you're probably just looking at a generous ensuite room rather than a self-contained studio. With the planning or construction, so developer, you build stuff out?
We do, yeah.
Yep. So, some developers I know, they really only just do planning, and then they flip the site. They just don't want to get involved. The risk is in the ground, and it just can't be done with the hassle. And then you've got others which are typically more contractor developers. They're kind of builders anyway, they're contractors, and they prefer to build stuff out, so they're constantly looking for consented sites. Do you have a preference on which one you like more? If I had to take you to a desert island, unless I'm not sure if that works in that analogy, but basically you can only do one for the rest of your life. Which one would you do? This episode is sponsored by Silverleaf Group, which is a privately owned real estate development and investment company focused on delivering aspirational, contemporary residential-led developments in southeast of England. Silverleaf Group are continually looking to acquire land and property suitable for investment and development. In particular, they have a proven track record of resolving sites with planning difficulties and achieving planning permission where others have failed. Now, they will consider all opportunities regardless of scale and size. Sites of consideration, they also include land assembly, including gardens and existing properties, public houses, pubs, buildings, scrap yards, petrol stations, office buildings, warehouses, hotels and guest houses, medical and nursing homes, freeholds of larger apartment blocks. They are particularly interested in properties with large gardens, blocks of apartments with communal gardens, and properties that sit on corner plots. These are in particular of interest. So if you own or know of a possible development site, they would welcome any opportunity to share their views on hopefully making an offer. If you would like a no obligation appraisal, please reach out to them and we'll have all the links in the show notes below.
I would probably do, that's a very good question actually. I was going to say I'd probably do the planning gain, albeit I do like being on site and building things. I think there's just something quite satisfying about taking a piece of land or an old property and demolishing it perhaps and building a block of apartments there. And I think part of what I like about it is that we often get objection and people don't necessarily understand plans, people don't understand how it might look and be finished, judge us by other developments they've seen which are perhaps not that great. And so it's a nice feeling when you finish a development and maybe some of the, I quite often will go and knock on the door of the local residents and say, look, we've finished, do you want to come and have a look?
Oh, really nice.
And just see what we've done. You may still not like it, yeah. But you know, at the end of the day, I just wanted to give you the opportunity and show you that perhaps it's not quite what you imagined it to be. And more often than not, the feedback is quite positive on that. And I think that, again, is sort of going back to that planning thing. It's about helping people to understand not being immediately against development, because not all development is bad. And the only way they can kind of get to grips with that is if they come and see that we're not the monsters that they might portray us to be.
It is an interesting one, because I've had quite a few conversations about it on a couple of occasions. It got a little bit heated about gentrification and why it's such a bad thing. And my always take is, well, the area was not really a great place. Like the idea of gentrification is that you are, yes, moving people out, which is the harsh part, but you're making the area desirable again. You're making the area nice to live. And I think that that's also something that a lot of people find, that developers are moving people out and making a profit. They don't really understand that actually, no, we're also making the area nice again, and for young people and for families and for people to go to work and regenerating an area. And I think that that's always a little bit of a misconception, which I struggle with. But when it comes to the planning, you're saying that you prefer, well, you would have said the planning, but you said actually you like to see the things come to life. When it comes to the risk element, because of the subjectivity on the planning side, if I'm trying to think, okay, which one's less risky for me, which one do you think is riskier?
Probably the planning, because it's so much less certain. Building obviously comes with its risks, but typically if you're out of the ground, everything else should be pretty straightforward from that point, unless it's something really complex. So as long as you do as much DD as you can from the outset, you should be able to mitigate a lot of that risk in terms of the build. With planning, we have obviously the MPPF, we have local plan, we have other suburban design guides, all this sort of stuff. But there's still a hell of a lot of ambiguity to the planning system, and it's then down to the political control of the local authority that you're submitting in, their appetite for development, and how that then feeds down into the planning department, what the head of planning is like, whether they're sort of pro or anti-development, all of these nuances, and they all differ from council to council. So,
and as somebody that really gets involved in the day-to-day of that, how important is it to get to know who is the head of planning and whether they are pro or against, and then the councils around them? Do you take a vested interest in trying to find out that information before you
for sure.
approach it?
For sure. So there was a point where probably for a good few years you could name me a property in Croydon, I could pretty much reel off the planning history of that property to you off by heart.
Wow.
So I would study the planning list almost daily at Croydon, and I think that was part of the reason why we were so successful in obtaining planning consents in that borough particularly, because we just knew exactly what was going on around us. We kind of got to understand through that what the officers would and wouldn't accept. And you have to kind of really learn that if you want to succeed. And we still do. I still do that now. And we'll study committee meetings, which are fortunately now webcast, so you can again get to understand what members' concerns are typically, what they will and won't accept. And then obviously you try and address those from the outset so that you have the best chance possible going through the planning system to get a positive result.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think these are decisions made by these people, and the more you get to know how they're making decisions, what they do like, what they don't like, the more chance you have of just, first time round, pretty much giving them exactly what they're looking for. Because I do get some people, like, everyone's got their opinion of what's best way, and some people are like, just start with more and then we'll end up with less. And then that's like, kind of makes some sort of logical sense, but at the same time, they're going to allow what they're going to allow anyway. So having that approach, when you ask different people, they say, well, no, you don't just kind of ask them for a tower, because they'll put their back up and you think you are being a greedy developer and you don't know what you're doing. So there's an element of, I think when people like Warren Buffett say the biggest risk is not knowing what you're doing, when it comes to planning, certainly is more important than ever to know what you're doing.
Planning is a very expensive process.
Yeah.
And so even on small schemes, you can expend tens of thousands of pounds. So if you don't know what you're doing and you're not getting it quite right, very quickly you can start to lose and risk a hell of a lot of money and go nowhere. And also from the owner's perspective, if you don't know what you're doing, they can actually end up blighting a site where you could have got a scheme, but where they put the wrong scheme in and then perhaps gone to appeal and got dismissed, and that inspector's taken a really dim view on development on that site, suddenly it's a very difficult position to get back from. So, we always say to owners, it's not always about who's offering you the highest price and the most money. You've got to drill into more detail. What's their experience? What have they succeeded at in the past? Do they know what they're doing? And it's the overall package that you should be considering.
Yeah, it is a gauntlet is running the planning system, in my opinion. But from your point of view, scheme sizes and the planning costs associated. So you've got, you said it's tens of thousands you can spend. I know that some people have come and told me, hey, Sam, we're going to spend £2,000 on this application. And I'm like, where did you get that from? From the website? Because it says, I know that might be the planning fee cost of 1,200 quid or whatever it is plus VAT. And I'm like, well, there's probably a little bit more to it than that. And I know that some people spend 50,000, 100,000, 250,000 and more. What, from the size of schemes that you're doing, is the average spend on a planning application in general, and what are those costs associated?
So we deal with a variety of schemes from 1 unit through to 44 is the biggest scheme we've got at the moment. So we've got quite a broad experience in terms of the size of schemes. Anything sort of in the low category, so 9 and less, which is considered a minor application. If it was one house, you might spend, say, £10,000. If you're getting into 9 flats, that could quickly leap up to £20,000-30,000, depending on what the constraints of the sites are. And then if you start getting into the kind of 40 unit area, it depends on the approach to the sites. If you're going straight in for a detailed planning consent for that number of units, particularly in a London borough, you're getting into 6 figures quite easily, because the government have decided that you should front load the planning system to give you better certainty at the output. Which is all very well for them to say that, but when you're footing the bill for every report that a council can throw at you, particularly with all the new ecology requirements that are just about to kick in and things like that, it's a very, very expensive process.
So yeah, so you mentioned ecology reports. What other sort of reports you probably need to make sure you have?
So you could have heritage, trees, ecology, drainage. Um, they're probably the kind of typical go-to. Transport, yeah. Parking surveys. If they see somewhere that potentially bats can roost in, then you then have to have the whole bat survey where they sit in the gardens overnight and listen out for bats, and they have to do that on 5 occasions. You know, it grows arms and legs very quickly.
I've heard if you missed a season or something, you got to wait like 9 months.
Yeah, badgers, that's another one, and you can only do them, I think, between something like July and November because of mating season. So it's just relentless.
I mean, you know what? It's one of the reasons why I love living and people in general is that there are people that are looking out for the right things in the right ways. Because the first time I ever heard that, like, the bat survey, I thought the bat was an acronym for something, and I was like, "What is the bat survey?" And they were like, "No, literally bats." And I was like, "Oh, okay. What's that got to do with anything?" And when I found out, I was like, "Okay, well, actually, it does kind of make sense." And so these things do usually have a reason, but then you've got the subjectivity of the NIMBYs who are, just they all want more housing for everybody, but they just don't want it on their doorstep. So when you're looking at a scheme, in terms of size and scale, do you have a minimum requirement now? I guess, and has that moved since you started 2003? Have you started to change your kind of parameters of what you feel is a worthwhile deal for you to do?
Yeah, so I think when we first started out, our first scheme was the house that we bought and got planning for another house to the side. The second deal that I ever did was a house which we again bought on market, and it was a detached house, quite run down, but had a huge garden. And to the one side there was apartments, so we felt like we had a fairly good chance, but there was actually, for the access point, a ransom strip owned by the local authority, so it came with its challenges. But we managed to get planning permission for 13 apartments on that, so we quite quickly kind of got into the larger schemes as we moved along. Now we're just about to break ground on a site for a single house. We did another very similar scheme last year. And as I say, we've got the kind of larger schemes that we're promoting as well. And I think we like to mix the two because typically the larger schemes do take longer.
Yeah.
The smaller schemes, you would hope, do move through quicker. So it just gives us a bit more range in terms of keeping our workflow going, rather than just being all of our eggs in one basket with the bigger schemes, and suddenly you sit there for 3-4 years and don't get a planning consent that you can utilise.
Because it can be, and the bigger the scheme, it's notoriously slow anyway, and obviously the bigger the scheme, the longer it takes. So yeah, I think mixing it up a little bit with the smaller stuff and the bigger stuff makes sense. And then in terms of building out, because over the last 18 months, for example, build costs have been going crazy. Are you building anything out at the moment, or is that something that you've decided actually for the moment, whilst build costs are volatile, we'll just kind of not do that for a while?
So we're breaking ground on a site which is refurbishment of an existing semi-detached house, and then a new 4-bed detached to the side.
Right.
And then we've got some planning applications which should be going to committee with recommendation for approval in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So we just want to see sort of how they fare and what the outcome of that is. One of those in particular is a fairly large scheme. So we're just weighing up whether that's one we would do ourselves. It would certainly be the biggest scheme we've built since we did one in South Croydon, which is 12 apartments and 4 houses. So that would be our next kind of step up, I guess, in terms of scale.
And then do you do it with a third-party contractor, kind of fixed price JCT? Yeah. You don't fancy kind of doing the contract management approach?
We've looked at it, but I think the reality is we're a very small team. We outsource pretty much everything within our business, and it's worked well for us in the not so good times. We're quite nimble, so we can scale our operation down very quickly and scale up very quickly at the same time. And I think you either are somebody that focuses on the kind of planning and development side, and then you might build some things out, but you effectively outsource that to your main contractor, or you are someone that is a contractor-led developer, and you have that team that sit in your office with the QSs and project managers, and you have that side to it. Unless you get to a certain size where you can do both effectively, and you're becoming more of a medium-sized house builder at that point, you can get into some sort of slightly strange territory if you sit somewhere in between. So for us, I think what we do works. We're comfortable with it, and so we're happy to sort of continue as we are, really.
And with the schemes that you've done, do you have a favourite?
Yeah, so we did a development in South Croydon, and basically we bought an HMO. It's an old vicarage building, so very large, sort of Edwardian style building, but quite neglected. The same family had owned it for 25 years. So we got a lawful development certificate initially to turn the 9 HMOs into flats, because they were all self-contained. They'd all been used continuously, so we effectively got lawful development certificates. There was 9 flats. And then off the back of that, we got permission to extend to the side and to the rear to create 4 houses, 4 terraced houses, and another 4 flats on the side. So we ended up with a fairly big scheme, and that was one that I was like, we should do this, because it just felt right. And it was a really nice scheme, good value add through the planning process. So we had that sort of buffer in there in terms of if anything did go slightly wrong with the construction side. And so we completed that development in 2019. We kept the apartments, we've sold the houses.
Nice.
And then 2 years ago, it had a fairly large communal garden, and there'd been a change in planning policy in Croydon. So we got planning permission for 2 semi-detached houses in the rear garden area. So we built those as well, and we've completed that
Very good.
last year. So we definitely maximised the site, but it works. It's compact, but it works, and everyone that lives there seems to be kind of very happy with the space and the communal areas and everything else. So
And you kept 4 of the flats?
we've kept all the flats.
You kept all the flats. So how many flats was it?
12.
12 flats, sorry, not 4 flats. It was 4 houses, I think.
Correct, yeah.
So 12 flats. One of the biggest regrets that I find a lot of developers have when they've been in the game as long as you have or longer is they say that we wish we kept more. And so the keeping of the flats, is that something that you've been doing since since starting? As your dad been doing that, or is that something that's happened more recently that you thought, it'd be nice to actually keep a few?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we just wanted something sitting in the background that provided us with a regularized income, because one of your biggest battles as a developer is actually managing your cash flow, because it never works how you want it to in terms of getting planning permission. You might not get any for 2 years, and then suddenly 3 will arrive in the same month. Great problems to have, but at the same time you're like, okay, now what do I do? So you're always battling your cash flow position. So if you've got something that's sitting there and providing a regularized income, it definitely helps with the sort of smooth running of your business as you go along.
Yeah, and I think if I was I don't like to sell anything if I can avoid it at all. And the capital growth, especially in London, the southeast, has been phenomenal. Now, will it be the same over the next 20 years as it's been over the last 20 years? Who knows? Hopefully, at the end of this year, when the interest rates start to fall, we'll start to see a little bit of a rally again, and time will tell. We'll do another podcast in 20 years from now and find out. But in the meantime, there's the most problematic scheme. Do you have any nightmares about a scheme that you embarked upon over the last 20 years that still haunts you today?
I mean, by nature, we don't give up on sites. So we are very determined. And an example of that is we have one site which took us 9.5 years
Wow.
to get to the planning position that we wanted to be at.
9.5 years.
9.5 years. And it took us about 5.5 years to get the first planning consent, but they were insistent on us keeping some light industrial use within this scheme because there was a derelict light industrial building on the site that hadn't been used for 20 years, but because it had that sort of designation, we had to incorporate it. And this is sometimes where the planning system, in my eyes, goes a bit awry because common sense doesn't always bite.
Residential area, you've got this light industry and there's no one's using it. It's like, let's just, no.
So we ended up with a scheme of apartments, which it sat between two different levels because a road at the back, road at the front, so two different levels. And in the middle of this block of apartments was a light industrial unit, which had a lift from the lower ground into the light industrial. That was a commercial size lift.
Smelly MOT garage or something.
So it took us another kind of 2.5 years to get rid of the commercial aspect of that site before we ended up with a...
Wasn't there like a PD of B1C or something, wasn't there?
This was quite a few years ago, so it was before the sort of days of PD. So that one was very, very torturous in terms of the planning process. We've had a few. I mean, I've been threatened by public people who feel so strongly about the planning application, to the point where they've got quite physical.
No way.
So, people are very emotive about this topic, and I don't see myself as someone that's overly confrontational, and I'm pretty laid back. And even then, people can really come at you.
Property development, not for the faint of heart, for a number of reasons.
No.
And, well, here's the other thing as well. So, property development, as you mentioned earlier as well, is that it's become a bit of a buzzword, and a lot of people are really, really keen on making lots and lots of money out of property development. And, of course, the Instagrams and everything else from the before and after photos always look absolutely phenomenal and brilliant. And then when they run the numbers through deal appraisals, they oh my God, how many zeros and all of that sort of stuff. I've noticed when I find people sending me stuff saying, hey, can I do this? Even people that are experienced that are like, okay, I've done a few houses or I've done a few flats. Now I want to take on this really like monster project, or they haven't even started yet and they want to do something that's quite significant. I always say start small, think big. I mean, what's your take on that? If somebody comes to you and says, but then at the same time, like what I don't want to do is squash people's dreams, because actually I probably can think of one or two people that did go out there and do, a multi-story development for one of, they might have done an HMO and then they've gone and done something. So they have taken that leap. But I always say that's the exception to the rule. I mean, what's your take on it all?
Yeah, I think, look, it's about the person, isn't it, and your skill sets. And if you've done other roles or other jobs and you've learned certain skills that can then apply and be transferred to property development, then there's no reason why you can't necessarily deliver on those things. But I think if you're kind of a virgin developer and, I don't know, you've done a homes under the hammer and bought a flat that you've refurbed and you've managed to make 30 grand out of it, and suddenly you then want to leap into new build, you have to understand the risks of what you're taking on, and the gravity of the situation if that doesn't go right, because you've got lenders and people like that are there and they're going to want their money, and you've given probably PGs and put some money in yourself. These are all very important things to consider, because you can lose everything if you get it wrong. So I would never want to dispel someone's desire to do it. One of the great things about property development is that anybody can do it. I don't have any formal qualifications in this field. I'm not a surveyor. I'm not, I haven't got any qualifications. I've self-taught everything. Sure. I've learnt off my dad, who very kindly passed his knowledge on to me. So you can succeed in it, but you have to tread cautiously and just be very aware of what you're getting yourself into. And that's the key part.
And you said, I think very importantly, you've surrounded yourself by good people from your dad, but then also you outsource a lot of the professional disciplines that you need to have around you. So we're talking like architects, planning consultants, I mean, what other things come into play? Is it like, do you need contractors? If you could you work in residual land value back? Do you need to know kind of what or quantity surveyor may be more appropriate? Um, what's the team that you have around you that you're in regular contact with, and how do you go about picking those people?
Some of it's trial and error. We've had the bad ones as well as the good ones. So I think it's the critical people from a planning perspective is your architect and a planning consultant, because they're fundamentally going to tell you what they think they can be achieved on the site. Yeah. And the interesting one with architects is that every architect will take a different view on a site. So don't be afraid to talk to 2 or 3 and get their views. Okay, you might have to spend some money getting them to do some feasibility, but if one comes forward with an idea that's a bit more creative and gets you an extra unit, that's money very well spent.
Happy days.
And I think what we did in the past was had a look round to see who other people were using, who was frequently putting applications in a given area, because the likelihood is they will know the planners, they'll know what they're looking for, they'll know what is or isn't accepted. So again, they've got knowledge which is of value to you in this process, and will save you time and money potentially if they can get it right for you first time round. If you go and get a amazing award-winning London architect that will charge you probably fortunes for a scheme that will look incredible, the planners might not like it because it's, say, too contemporary, but also they might design something that costs you fortunes to build and therefore doesn't work. So you might have the planning permission, but if you go to sell it on or build it, everyone's looking at it going, oh, this is just too expensive, it doesn't work. So it's got to be appropriate to the location and typology of the site.
Yeah, I think the architects can have some, if you give them too much artistic freedom, and they don't understand the commercial element to it, the commercial side to it, they can probably draw you something that really looks good, but not necessarily feasible in terms of actually delivering it. Have you used any kind of AI tools yet to try and cut out your architect fees and get some feasibility?
No.
Is that a thing that you think that might be in the future on the roadmap?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think AI is obviously just got endless possibilities. Some of it scares me a bit.
Yeah,
if I'm being honest. My wife probably embraces it more than I do.
I won't be here for the next podcast. It'll be
no,
too IA.
Quite. But yeah, technology is going to continue to evolve and make this process perhaps easier in some aspects, but more difficult in others. And I think particularly when you come to things like creativity, which is design, it's architecture, to try and replace that process with something that is entirely technology driven, would be terrible in my view. Part of the reason we have a variety of buildings and how they look and differences and interest is because you've got different input from qualified people that dedicate a large part of their life to get a qualification. So if that was then sort of just smashed out by a computer, I don't think you'd have the same value out of it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think I'm kind of all for technology, and I think I have been up until I turned 40 last year, and then suddenly I feel like an old person where I'm like starting to get scared of it, and I can't work the TV anymore. But I think overall, in my opinion, the human element is always going to be needed or necessary, or it's going to have a unique take on things. But I would like to think that also, if I was to plug in, I think you can do that these days as well. You can kind of get some facades and stuff, and then design this, that, and the other. And what comes out of it is pretty cool, and the speed that it comes out.
Yeah.
Just whether it's going to be, the human element still though.
I think there's parts of the presentation process that could certainly benefit from AI, so CGIs, this sort of stuff.
Exactly.
And the realism of those is getting so much better as time goes on that you see some CGIs and it's very close to reality.
Because if you can hook that up with a costing as well and say, look,
Exactly.
this is what your facade's going to look like, and actually it's hooked up to a BCIS or something that's got some merchants. It's like, this is what we could make it look like, and this is going to be the cost at the end.
So we did on the scheme. We've got a scheme in Wallingham, which is 21 apartments. We actually did like a VR walkthrough of the development, so
Wow.
the planners and residents could actually see what it would be like to be on site and to walk around.
Amazing.
Still refused it.
Oh, damn.
And we had to go to appeal and won it at appeal. But it was a helpful tool because the officers themselves were actually on board. It was their seniors that
Right.
just in principle said that it was not acceptable.
How does that work as well? Because you've got like the officers, I feel like they say yes to almost anything. Or if you just go long enough in the process, they'll eventually just say, yeah, okay. And then they go, oh, sorry, it got refused because I sent it upstairs and they said no. So it's like, it's almost a bit pointless speaking to the officers because if they say yes, it's almost as valuable as having a pre-app saying yes.
So something that Croydon introduced a few years ago, and I don't know if they still do it now, but they'd have like a round table once a week where all the officers would sit round the table, and any application that needed kind of review, so typically new developments, if you had an extension, things like that, they wouldn't obviously bother with that, but any sort of major development or new development, they would sit round a table and they'd all discuss it and they'd get it signed off. So you had a fairly consistent decision-making process from the outset. What we do see in some local authorities is that a planning officer will review it, come to their conclusion, write up a report recommending it for approval, then goes to a team leader who'll sit there and suddenly take a completely different view on it, and then it gets refused. It's very disheartening as an applement, and I'm sure as it is for an officer.
Yeah, pretty much happened to me. She was like, oh, but I'm like, oh, what's the point in that? It's wasted literally like 12 months going backwards and forwards talking about what the bike rack was going to look like. Pointless.
You get it's a similar sort of outcome at committee as well. You know, you can get everybody on board, officers who are qualified, experienced, review it, say it's acceptable, meets all the policy requirements, and then it will go to committee and they overturn it, sometimes on fairly strange grounds that don't necessarily hold that merit or judgment that an officer might have.
How many of your sites, on average, like percentage-wise, have to go to appeal?
I'd probably say over the last, say, 5 years, 60-70%.
Wow.
I mean, when I first started out, I would say 90% of our schemes went to appeal, and we won 95%.
Wow.
We're probably success rate at the moment is probably about 90%.
Okay.
So we've got a very good record of getting planning consents on sites, and I think partly that's experience, partly we present something in what we feel is the right way. So you can't skimp on planning applications because people then don't understand it and their imagination runs riot and they think you're going to build some skyscraper and it's not anything like
leave
that.
no doubt and give them no reason to say no, basically is what I've been told in the past. And then if you're getting that number of successes over the years and the 95%, that's a pretty good rate of success to get on the planning system. Have you ever had a site where you got refused even at appeal, and then what do you do?
Yeah, we had a site that's probably about 6 years ago in the Reigate and Banstead area, and we felt it was an obvious site, backland, so some sort of objection levels came in on that basis, and the case officer was not particularly enamoured by the application being a backland application. So we had 3 schemes, they all got refused and they all got dismissed at appeal. And so we had to walk away in the end.
Did you sell the site or was it an option?
No, it was on an option.
Okay, so we just cut your losses.
Take it on the chin. And we've only ever walked away from, I think, 3 or 4 sites in 21 years of business.
Were they all option agreements coincidentally, or was there ever a site that like, bloody hell, we actually own that now and we haven't had?
If we ever buy a site uncon, we've always got an exit. So we never pay hope value unless we are very certain that
Very
we're going to
hopeful.
get something on there. But typically we won't expose ourselves to that risk. So the plan B is always, we very rarely will we buy just vacant land, because if you don't get planning, then it's worth nothing really. So there's typically always an asset on the site, and then we can either refurbish and extend it, whatever that might be, just to effectively get our money back and exit. Fortunately, we've never had to sort of bring ourselves to that position. So yeah, touch wood. That stays,
Touch wood, touch wood.
stays
Long
the
may
same
it
way.
continue.
Yeah.
We'll have to come back in 20 years' time. So but there'll be robots here instead of us. Best bit of advice that you've ever had. What is the best bit of advice you've ever had?
A profit is never a bad thing, and by that it was meant that don't be too greedy. So if you can buy something and make a profit on it, whatever that profit might be, that's still not a bad position to be in. And I think sometimes you can sort of, particularly if like an architect suddenly brings a scheme to you that you've never even imagined on a site, and you're like, wow, this, I could really do well out of this. And you suddenly sort of go down that road, whereas actually you should have just followed your original idea and got in and out pretty quick. So I think, that's always been quite a good piece of advice. And I think the other one is work smart, not hard. And you always have to. I was a victim of, in my 20s, of working hard and not necessarily always smart.
Yeah.
So I think as you get older, you come to realise that you need to maintain a good balance in your life and maybe prioritise things in a slightly different way. And yeah, I would definitely sort of carry that mantra moving forward.
Makes sense. And what would be the worst bit of advice?
Worst bit of advice. Probably just buy it. I think I've been to auctions and I've sat next to people and they're like, just buy it.
Just do it.
And they're, fortunately, they weren't talking to me, they were talking to someone else. But I'm like, that's the worst piece of advice. And they were kind of just flicking through the catalogue and sort of pointing things out, and a bit novice
Looks
from what
cheap.
I gathered. Yeah, just buy it, just buy it. And the reality is, going back to your the previous question, I think another piece of great advice is DD is king. If you can do DD and get the right people to give you that advice, your risk will reduce dramatically. If you just buy it, your risk will increase dramatically, and you will probably get unstuck. You might wing it once or twice, but eventually that attitude will definitely catch you out.
Makes sense. And my final question, which this program is called Property People, two of my favorite things, and you're obviously a successful property person. What you know about planning and development is exceptional. If somebody else wants to be a successful property person, what sort of traits and characteristics do you think they need to have?
Patience, perseverance, and personality.
Very good. All the P's with the property people as well.
Yeah.
Justin, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been my pleasure because I love talking about these topics. And when I find somebody that is so coherent and kind of well-versed in these subjects, I think I get most satisfaction, and I'm sure everybody else will. So hopefully we'll do this again sometime
for sure.
soon, and we'll
Absolutely,
talk a bit more in depth about the developments you're doing as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Sam.